Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode, we speak to a panel of distinguished experts who would otherwise have joined us at the annual Clement Center Summer Symposium on History, Statecraft, and Diplomacy in Beaver Creek, Colorado. This event, one of the crown jewels of the Clement Center program, draws together a variety of senior scholars, experts, and rising scholars to discuss issues related to, well, history, diplomacy, and statecraft. On today's podcast, we're joined by three people who would otherwise be on panels there to discuss the way forward out of the current crises right now. We're joined by three scholars who I'll ask to introduce themselves right now. And Kori, if we can begin with you.
Sure. I'm Kori Schake, and I have the great good fortune to lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm an errant school teacher.
Jim?
Jim Goldgeier. I'm the Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow at the Brookings Institution and also a professor of international relations at American University, where I was dean from 2011 to 2017.
And Derek?
And I'm Derek Chollet. I'm the Executive Vice President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States based in Washington.
Thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us today. As you know, as all of our listeners know, we face a really unique confluence of crises right now. The COVID-19 pandemic has had an unprecedented economic and social impact on our society, and as well has caused many people to reconceptualize what national security means. While pandemic and disease has made appearances in strategy documents for decades, the magnitude of what that means, I think, wasn't really apparent to many practitioners until we were confronted with it. At the same time, our nation finds itself convulsed by issues of racial injustice and the response to issues in our criminal justice system in a way that we haven't been probably since 1968 or before. And this likewise causes a reconceptualization of what it means to be secure in our nation, as well as questions about the role of military and security forces in our nation that we more commonly associate with discussions from comparativist scholars who look at issues of security structures in other regimes. Since one of the goals of Texas National Security Review is to bring together the policy and the academic community, it seemed that this was a really useful moment to take a time when we're reconceptualizing both national security and the academic community, and to talk about how it is that academics and those who study questions of war and peace broadly defined can best influence and help as we work our way forward coming out of these two parallel crises. And so the first area I'd like to turn to is this question of how we're reconceptualizing national security. And Derek, perhaps if I can start with you, what do you think about the overall impact of these crises on our conception of what it means to be secure, what resources we devote to it, how it is that we seek to achieve it?
First of all, it's great to be with you. I'm very sorry we are doing it at sea level and not in the mountains at Beaver Creek with our colleagues there. And very much looking forward to hopefully in 2021, the Clement Center being able to convene us again at Beaver Creek. And I'd very much hope to be invited again. It's a terrific program. And so I'm glad to try to keep it going as much as we can in this way this year. Look, clearly it's, as you noted, this crisis in many ways is not surprising. I mean, there have been many analysts for decades now talking about the threat of pandemics and playing out scenarios on how it could ripple across the world and affect our societies and our economies and our security. But nevertheless, we find ourselves woefully unprepared for it. We in the United States, the entire world has found themselves unprepared for it. And it's absolutely changing our concept of security. I mean, if you think about it, I would posit that this virus has done more damage to our economies, to our societies, and killed more people than any conventional power could have done in the last 3 months. So if you think of kind of what you think of the very basic concept of security, how do you keep people safe? We find ourselves very vulnerable right now in a way that is almost unique, short of nuclear Armageddon. So obviously, that's going to have to change the way we think about security, how we budget for security, how we decide priorities within our national security budget. Already, I think those of us, certainly I can speak for myself, I assume Kori and Jim are in the same boat. I've I have now followed public health experts with the same care and enthusiasm that folks I'd never heard of before. That before I would, as much as I follow Jim and Kori, right, in terms of what they're saying about the world, because it's also immediate for all of us. The other thing that struck me, and part of this is from my experience working right now at GMF, where we have offices throughout Europe, is that it's a very unique moment in that we all are going through something at the same time, experiencing at the same time. This isn't like a war in a far off place that seems distant to everyone except those directly involved in it. You know, I'm from the American Midwest, from Nebraska. My family was dealing with the same situation there in terms of, the disruption to their lives and the threat to their security from this virus, as I was dealing with here in Washington, D.C., as my colleague in Warsaw, Poland was dealing with there. And so now this is kind of gets to what I think can hopefully come out of this, is that, there's two vectors. There's this idea that we are actually all in this together. And there is a kind of politics and leadership, and there's a set of answers available to try to better prepare us for things like this down the road that reflect the idea that we are in this together. But then there's another kind of answer that it takes you in a totally different direction, which is, let's build the walls higher, let's isolate ourselves further, and we're on our own here, and we got to look out for ourselves only. And I think that will be fundamentally, I'm grossly oversimplifying things here, but that's fundamentally going to be the debate. It's a debate we've been having, of course, here in the US, but fundamentally that's the choice we're going to have going forward.
Jim, I'm curious your thoughts.
I don't have that much to add. I just maybe come at it from a slightly different angle and add on the issue that has emerged since the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen. We look to the state to keep us safe. That's our basic expectation of what the government is supposed to do. All right. There's all sorts of other stuff, but the basic level, we just look for it to keep us safe. And, there was already low trust in government before the pandemic hit. And then you have the pandemic, and you look at other countries and they're doing better and fewer people are dying, and you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, why isn't my government keeping me safe? Why isn't my government going all in on this the way they did after 9/11 to try to keep me safe from terrorists? They're not doing that. And then you come to the Black Lives Matter protests. We have, we've heard from African Americans over and over again about the experiences that they have with respect to the state. The state doesn't make them feel safe in many cases, right? If the police is coming after you for running while black, or walking in your neighborhood while black, or just sleeping in your house while black, it's not doing its basic job there either. In fact, it's aggressively making you less safe. And even though we knew this existed, we now really are, I think, confronting this to an extent that we just hadn't previously. And the one thing that I'm heartened about by this moment is I think we see people across the country, big cities, small towns, everywhere in America, people are saying, they were horrified by what happened to George Floyd. You could look at that and realize, okay, that's not right. Breonna Taylor shouldn't be killed in her home. The extent to which people really are in terms of the polling data, really both with respect to COVID and with respect to Black Lives Matter, the unity of the population in, yes, I believe distancing is important with respect to COVID. Yes, I believe we need to do something about the situation that exists in America, and that, in fact, yes, Black lives do matter. We haven't seen that kind of unified polling data on anything in a long time. So that does give me some hope, but it does mean we just, we are in this process of reconceptualizing.
Kori?
I agree with the points that both Derek and Jim made, but I think they may push in opposite directions. On the one hand, it seems to me ineluctable that the pandemic is going to cause us to expand our definition of national security. It's not going to be good enough to have capable military forces. Praise God, someday we actually prove capable of whole of government coordination in responding to the challenges that nation faces. But it seems to me there's going to be quite a lot of questioning from the American public about why isn't healthcare part of national security? Why isn't preparation for surge in hospital support part of national security? And that's going to raise questions about why is the defense budget the only part of the American government spending that we A, splash out generously on, and B, assume is well spent. Always been a mystery to me why people think defense spending is, really, really carefully followed when they haven't been able to conduct an audit but once in 18 years. So I think it's an extraordinary opportunity for academics to get involved in the policy debate, because we do need to understand how wide should the margins be for defining our national security, and where do we make important trade-offs. But I think that will cut against the grain of what Jim raised, which is both in terms of social justice in the United States and making manifest equal justice for all Americans, that and people's immediate familial concerns because of the pandemic will cause us to be much more inward looking, where I think an expanded definition of national security pushes us further outward. It's strategic depth to be involved in international organizations and alliance relationships that allow us to see early problems in formation and to act while the costs are still relatively low to managing them.
Yeah, I mean, can I just one stray thought, but it's just something that Kori's comment sparked, was that the other thing, and I don't mean to make this sound like a cop out, which is like it depends on how this ends, because it is true. Like I've been thinking, what happens, and it seems very plausible from where we sit today, that say Europe and good part, large parts of Asia, for example, are, start to by fall look more normal. You can travel pretty freely, you can, congregate. And it's the US that is unable to get around. So it's, like Americans can't get into the EU right now, without being in quarantine for 14 days or not at all. Whereas if you're in Germany, you can go to Italy or France or whatnot. And so that's going to have a huge impact on American power if we're seen as the ones, like, we're kind of in the Brazil developing world category in terms of our handling of the crisis. Now, if we can turn it around, if my gut sitting, as it sit here today, if I'm wrong and that doesn't feel like that at this point, but that's one where I don't like, that's going to have a huge impact on these questions we're wrestling with. We just assume we're going to come out of this okay. And I don't think we can make that assumption.
Jim Mattis and I are having the fun of doing a little bit of work on what an international order that excludes the United States from cooperation might look like, on exactly the line of thinking you're talking about, Derek.
Yeah. Just not like just as a practical matter, because the pandemic is so deeply rooted here. Yeah. Interesting.
So I'm curious, a thought occurred to me, Kori, when you were speaking about the focus of our security efforts. And it strikes me that really ever since we changed the name of the department to focus on defense, we have ironically changed the focus of the department to defending far forward. And so the notion of defense involvement domestically is something that strikes most Americans as unusual at best, if not irregular. And yet, in the course of the crises we've been seeing, we have seen significant involvement of Defense Department resources, both in response to COVID and then also perhaps more notoriously in response to civil unrest. And I'm curious, if we were looking at this in another country, we would talk about whether this was a cause for security sector reform. What's your thought about how that affects the perception and conceptualization of national security in the U.S.?
Thank you for pitching straight in the middle of my strike zone. I appreciate that. So I agree with you that we're not really the Department of Defense, we're the Department of Expeditionary Operations. But it's also a very great luxury to be able to fight your wars far forward instead of on your own territory. I think if we had been more globally engaged and more creative, um, dealing with the pandemic where it started and preventing its spread anywhere else would have been great for the 115,000 Americans who are dead from the pandemic and good for the world. So I don't object in principle to expeditionary internationalism, but you're right, Doyle, that this is such a fraught moment for the relationship of the American military to the American public. Two big reasons that the United States military has consistently over time had such high approval ratings from broad civil society in the United States is, first of all, because they're not used in domestic operations other than the super happy face of hurricane assistance and support to civilian authorities in natural disasters, right? So people have that happy association rather than Kent State in 1970 or
Bonus army.
exactly right, the bonus army experience of active duty forces trampling on American citizens. The second thing, though, and I think this connects to the demands for equal justice right now. The second reason there's so much public support for the American military is that as many avenues of social mobility and economic mobility have been constrained, the American military continues to be a reliable path safely into the middle class. And the pressure that National Guardsmen are coming under now, for example, may limit people's, if this goes on or if it's not corrected quickly, may limit people's willingness to join military service, guard, or active duty, and that will cut off yet another conveyor belt into the middle class. So both those things are really important as we think about how we handle this. I would just say, as somebody who's been quite critical of Secretary Esper and General Milley's public comportment in the last couple of weeks, I think it's an incredibly healthy and positive sign that first Secretary Esper and then General Milley acknowledged the mistakes that they had made in positioning themselves to appear partisan in support of the president's policies, and how what a sign it is of the strength of professionalism in the American national security community that an avalanche of civic society voices reinforced that position on both of their parts, that they were way out of line and that they not only needed to bring it back, they needed to take remedial action that corrected the center of gravity and how the public looks at our military establishment.
If I can just second that, Kori has been a leading thinker and writer on these issues, long before this crisis. And I can say that, from where I sit, the only silver lining I can see from what we've watched happen over the last few weeks here is that we are having this discussion so openly, and that the kind of the fundamental strength of the institutions, the civic strength of the institutions, we are seeing that play out, both folks in uniform and out of uniform, because we need that, because this is not going to get any better over the next 5 months. So
In fact, it's likely to get a lot worse.
it's going to get a lot worse. This election, to my mind, is going to be as fraught as any election we've had since 1876. It's going to be contested, and Trump will insinuate, and if not, do worse than insinuate, some kind of role for security forces in what he's already deemed a fraudulent election. So this is all assuming he loses. We don't know who's going to win. I'm pretty confident it's going to be close, and I'm pretty confident that if Trump's seen as losing, he's going to say he didn't lose. And so there's all sorts of questions that are being raised now that prior to this crisis, I was worried we were going to sleepwalk into, just like General Milley kind of sleptwalked across Lafayette Park without thinking about what this looks like, how to handle these situations. And so now, unfortunately, it came to this point. I think lots of folks kind of understood we were probably going to be heading this way anyway, because this is where Trump takes things. But so I feel like there's some antibodies in a way that that are being created now that are going to be very important. And I frankly think we can go a little further, by the way, too. And I think Congress can push a little bit more in this direction, because obviously norms, it doesn't do much good when you talk about norms only after they've been trampled. So we can get out ahead of this a little bit to try to prevent the worst in November.
I think that's a very smart contribution, Derek.
So the second area that we're seeing a substantial reconceptualization that's relevant to the work that we do at TNSR is in the whole notion of the academic community. And any of us who were teaching this semester experienced the disruption of suddenly becoming online teachers, whether we had ever intended or aspired to that or not. And we're taking a look at the likelihood that the fall semester is going to be in whole or in part conducted remotely. That's affected not only graduate education and post-secondary education, but also primary and secondary education as well. And so I guess my question, and Jim, if we can start with you as a former dean of a policy school, is how do these changes affect both the prospects for the academic market and how academia influences policy?
So the academic enterprise, like everything else, is being heavily disrupted. And I think that thinking about disruption at the center of what we do is actually pretty important. So think about what our international affairs schools do. We have faculty members who are doing research on international topics, and they're also training the next generation. They're training master's students, and in some cases, as with the DC schools, or several of the DC schools, training undergraduates as well. And this is a reminder that our graduates, when they go out into the world, over the next decades that they're working, disruption is going to be a major feature of their lives as professionals. So we really need to think about, are we doing enough in our curriculum to be preparing people to be professionals in a world in which they're going to be faced with lots of disruptions, whether we're talking about climate change or AI or the things we've just seen like broken supply chains and pandemics. And I don't think that we've really put that sort of management of risk and management of disruption enough at the center of our teaching. I mean, the immediate thing, of course, for the schools is going to be how are they going to deliver their education this coming year? A lot of them are talking about a mix. I have argued that this talk about hybrid, that is this mix of on-campus and online, is an excellent approach for after the pandemic. But I don't really see how you do it during the pandemic. I think we are going to be online in the fall. Some of the schools, Kennedy School came out, for example, and said they're going to be online in the fall.
Exclusively online.
Exclusively online. Yeah. And I just don't see, I mean, a lot of schools are talking about how they're going to do a mix. The football schools were first to come out and talk about how they were going to do it. But everybody wants to be on campus. I mean, you want the students there. Faculty and staff want to be there. Just a question of like, how could you actually pull it off? And going through a lot of the plans, I don't see a workable plan yet for how you actually do it. Maybe the California schools can set up tents and just do, small classes outside. But anybody that has to go into a building is going to have a problem. So I really don't see how that's going to happen. And then there's this question of mean, there's the academic job market for people finishing up. Schools are they're going to have hiring freezes. So we don't expect to have a lot of opportunities for students who've just finished. There are PhD students who are in process. What about those students who are relying on field work to do their dissertations? Do they wait it out? Do they change their topics midstream? And then, as I'm sure we'll get into, sort of how do you think about providing opportunities for faculty who've really been on the outside of the national security conversation? How do we get those voices in? I mean, we've just talked about global health and race. We have lots of scholars who work on those issues. We have lots of scholars at my school, at SIS. We have scholars working on both those issues. Have we asked them previously to participate in conversations about national security? No, not really.
And would they be rewarded in tenure reviews for having cast their interest that widely?
Right, and I mean, it's just really right, and even just for just them thinking about their own careers, right? Is that something they want to be doing, or do they keep the focus that they've kept? And so there's a lot of churn, and we're going to see lots of different things coming out. I think that, this is a moment to think creatively, and I was reflecting recently for a piece on sort of rethinking the coming academic year on the disruption of 30 years ago. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that created a big disruption in international affairs. And it was, of course, largely seen as positive with lots of opportunities, right? Oh, we've got all these countries in Central and Eastern Europe that want to become market democracies. Now we've got lots of opportunities for people to go out and help build market democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. And, globalization is happening. Wow, that seems like a really awesome thing. Globalization is going to be great. This disruption doesn't seem so great. So how do we respond to it? It's obviously hugely challenging, but where are the opportunities, and how can we help participate in forging ahead during and after?
Derek and Kori, I'm very interested in your thoughts on this. I shared with you guys earlier, I was involved in a discussion last night with a group of academics, and they were looking out at the job market, and one of them, a very senior and well-intentioned academic, said, people need to think about going into the policy space because the academic space is going to be really limited. And as I mentioned, that's like telling a talented college athlete that you really ought to think about coaching. There's a lot fewer coaching jobs than there are player jobs. And similarly, the policy community is not nearly as large as the number of people employed in the academic side. But how do we take a look at getting the bright thinkers, both in traditional security as well as as Jim mentioned, fields that haven't ordinarily been considered part of security? How do we get those people involved in and informing the policy discussion at a time when we're thirsty and really in need of good ideas?
Kori.
It's not clear to me that there's a big problem with academics having access to the policy market. I love the project that Jim Goldgeier helped found, Bridging the Gap. There's never been an easier time for academics to get policy ideas published, because the traditional gatekeepers and the traditional credentialing have declined in control over access. So I'm not sure what the balance is of availability of jobs in the academic versus policy markets. But the great thing about the policy market is how entrepreneurial it is. I mean, academia is a medieval guild by comparison. Any idiot can get elected president in this country, and they can appoint any idiot they want to whatever post they want. And so put your shoulder to the wheel and write about what you care about, and join a campaign, and go, volunteer for a governor's staff in your off hours. There's so many points of accessibility into the policy world that I think that's the difference that I see, that academia continues to have such rigid ability to gatekeep, whereas the policy environment's incredibly entrepreneurial.
So you're saying there's a chance?
Kori and I have this running joke going back now a couple of years where it used to be that we would do these things and we would disagree on everything, but like now we do them and we just agree on everything. So that's why I'm setting this up, because I agree totally with Kori on this. And I feel that I'm cautiously optimistic about the job market in the policy world, the government and non-government. So, the think tank world, obviously we're all figuring out what the economic crisis is going to mean to our funding. And my view is there's probably going to be a bit of a lag effect in the think tank world. That we're not a outfit that depends on people to people in-person interaction, like a restaurant or something. But some of our funders, as the crisis, big foundations and governments and whatnot, as the crisis kicks in, it's obviously going to affect endowments too. Next year will be dicey, but so far so good. But that said, my joke with think tanks is a crisis is good for business generally, because if the world is uncertain and there's a lot of questions out there and people are anxious about the future, funders are interested, there's an audience for your work. Peace and prosperity can be kind of boring for a think tank, right? So, and as Kori said, it can be very entrepreneurial. I mean, I just reflect on, just speaking for GMF, 3 years ago, we didn't have anyone at GMF who thought at all about foreign actors and using the social media space to try to manipulate our democracies. And now it's one of GMF's biggest and most thriving programs. And it didn't exist 3 years ago. And so, and I imagine that I'm sure AEI is thinking, well, AEI is actually, because of the expertise they've got, is already, I would argue, probably the leader in the public health space right now in terms of just helping, inform the public of how to think about this crisis and practical steps to help governments manage it. Scott Gottlieb, who's one of Kori's colleagues at AI, is sort of my guru of understanding what's going on. And
He's fabulous. The rest of us just park his car and get him.
I'll go mow his lawn every day just because, help him out, give him more time to think about how to save us all. But it seems to me that there's huge opportunities to try to create these connections that, as Jim pointed out, haven't been made, whether it's on public health and security or the role of social justice and racial issues in thinking about that differently in national security. I tend, again, agree with Kori. It seems to be probably the incentive structure needs to change more on the academic side, probably, because we have the architecture there. I mean, Jim, I could see bridging the gap and the Beaver Creek Conference, which is a miniaturized version of this effort. The work that the Clements Center does is perfectly positioned to bring these voices into the discussion. It's just whether the incentive system is going to work on the academic side. I think on the policy side, we're going to go there. I mean, that's the government's going to go there and the think tank world's going to go there.
Yeah, and I think, the opportunities in the next few years are going to be on the non-academic side for people who are finishing up their PhDs and coming out. Look, if Joe Biden wins the election and comes in next January, all across government, you're going to have to rebuild agencies, and so you're going to have lots of opportunities for people coming in. And also, there are huge growing opportunities for political science PhDs to go work in Silicon Valley. There are all sorts of data science positions that are available. And in fact, at our PhD workshop in Bridging the Gap, and thanks, Kori, for the mention of it, at the PhD workshop, we did our workshop in 2019. We actually did it back in Berkeley, where the project started, because we wanted to bring some folks in from Silicon Valley to talk to the PhD students about what kind of opportunities exist. It was fascinating for me to hear. It's a lot more lucrative. So I think the students were their ears definitely perked up. But so the challenge actually in academia is that students don't have a lot of guidance in their home departments. The faculty members they work with typically haven't worked in either the policy space or the business space, and so it's one of the things that we're trying to do through Bridging the Gap. We were supposed to have our faculty workshop this week. Kori was scheduled to speak earlier this week. We told the cohort they have the right of first refusal to come next June, so hopefully most of them will be able to come and they'll be able to meet Kori at that time. It's also interesting. We are doing some virtual programming And I'd say the one other thing is the opportunities for academics who work on international issues to apply their knowledge here in the United States. And we just did a virtual program, for example, through BTG, and we had a professor from UMass Boston, Michelle Yurkovich, who works on food security. Normally, she's doing her work with USAID and she's doing work overseas. And she's now gotten involved with working with local groups in Boston dealing with food security. And I just, I tried this. I had this initiative when I was dean called From the Global to the Local. And, how could we take our ideas and the work we do internationally and be helpful to our host city, Washington, D.C., and deal with issues of, of health and security and gun violence and these other sets of issues. And, there are a lot of scholars, I think, who want to participate. And the more I talk to folks from around the country, they want to be engaged with their local community. So I see lots of opportunities. It's the PhD students in their programs and coming out need guidance on how to do things other than just applying for academic jobs that aren't going to be there.
So can I add one other thing, Doyle, which is that one of the weird anomalies in the survey data that Jim and I collected for Warriors and Citizens in 2015 or 16 was how much the attitudes of people who came on the job market after 2008 bear similarities to people who lived through the Great Depression. And it's not surprising once you realize the connection. They have never had the kind of economic stability and security that those of us a generation older than them had. And so they look at the world differently. And that yearning for greater stability is leading a lot of talented young people to stay in school right now, when in fact their professional advantage might be to join the Marine Corps, to join the Peace Corps, to go to Teach for America, to help their local food bank figure out a better system. So put the scholastic skills to use to civic purpose right now is actually a great career move. And you don't need to stay in school just because it feels safe because you're good at it. So I would encourage that young scholars potentially listening to this to think much more broadly about this moment and not to overinvest in near-term security.
Yeah, and I think the notion of continuing graduate education as a default is it's not new to this time, but it rarely ends in someone who is happy, productive, and constructive in the community they want to be happy, productive, and constructive in. As we're wrapping up the time, I'm going to ask each of you who sit in this distinctive and important position at the nexus of policy and academia a two-part question that is terribly unfair.
Two-part questions are the bane of those of us who live in this space.
Absolutely. So the first is, well, the question is the same, but it's under two scenarios. And the question is, what, in your view, is the best way in which we can harness the strength, the power, the thoughts of academia to shape and influence our policy going forward? The two-parter is that I think we've all talked under an assumption of what this would look like in the event that this administration does not get a second term. And so what I would ask you to do is to address whether, and if so, how that changes in the event of a Democratic administration that is likely, I think, to be more globally and internationalist focused versus a continuation of a second Trump administration that is likely to continue a more isolationist and transactional foreign policy and national security approach than what the traditional national security canon has advocated. Having just laid that out, who is the least prepared and who can I spring this on the most quickly?
I'll take a swing at that.
Thank you.
So first, I think a Biden presidency would be a much better national security presidency than a Trump second term. And I say that as a conservative Republican But I think there are three reasons for it. First, because President Trump is so willfully destructive of the kind of alliance relationships and international institutions that are American force multipliers in the world. And so just stopping doing a lot of the stuff the Trump administration's doing would unquestionably put us in a better place. The second reason is that people are policy, right? And so Derek Chollet going back into government is going to be good for us all. And I look forward to starting to disagree with him again once we have that luxury. So
Inshallah,
the
right.
quality of people who are
Right.
going to come into a Trump administration versus, for a whole bunch of reasons that are about President Trump and the opposition that many Republicans had to serving in a Trump administration, you're just going to get a better cadre of people trying to make policy. And the third reason is, I think, the kinds of intrinsic connections that that the people around Vice President Biden are willing to engage. So actually, maybe this is just the second reason reinforced. That is the reach into academia, the willingness to engage with others, the willingness of others to engage with them, I think will make for much better national security policies.
Yeah, if I could piggyback on that, I totally agree with everything Kori said, and listeners should also know. Kori says that she established her bona fides in terms of praising Biden by also ripping into Biden in the pages of the Atlantic recently.
Guys, to fix that stuff.
So no, no. No, no, no. So this is she's not just sucking up here. Like she's actually she can deliver the punch too. I mean, look, a couple thoughts. I think first on the people, which I agree with Kori, that's the core policy is people, and knowing a lot of the people around the vice president and having served seeing the vice president in action, it's going to be a totally different game in terms of the opportunity to engage the outside, and the great idea Kori had about service and expanding the idea of how you think of service. Like, I think there's going to be more opportunities in a Biden administration because I would foresee something, along the lines of a WPA or something that we had in the Depression era being explored in a Biden presidency. So there will be more opportunities. If he doesn't win, I think the biggest challenge will be the extension and the escalation of the domestic crisis we have. And I've always believed that with Trump, barring some, frankly, mistake, because I don't think Trump's interested in getting us in a big war, but he could stumble his way into one. But barring that, I always thought the most damage Trump was going to do to most consequential thing of the Trump era for American foreign policy was going to be the turbulence at home. I'm actually a little surprised it took as long as it did because the pre-existing conditions have been there for a while. I think a lot of it was because of an economy that was overly jacked up, for a variety of reasons. But this reckoning, as many people have pointed out, much smarter than I am, this reckoning's been coming for a while, and Trump is sort of the worst possible leader for this moment in terms of trying to keep a lid on things. And it seems to me that if he gets a second term, particularly under the conditions that he would get it, where he's going to lose the popular vote, by twice as much as Hillary Clinton beat him in 2016, we're going to have fundamental questions about the governance of this country on the table. That's going to make, America's role in the world kind of a secondary issue, frankly, for us. So that's not a great optimistic way of telling people like how to plug in. But I would just say that if you are, if you're a civically minded person, and I expect all of our listeners are, and you're someone who wants to try to make the world better and do the best for America, there's going to be a lot of work no matter who the next president is, because there's a big rebuilding job that's going to be necessary, and not just rebuilding, a reinvention that's necessary. If it's Biden, if it's Trump, the stakes are going to be really high about what our democratic future is going to look like.
And the only point I would just add from an academic perspective, and it really comes out of the work that we do at Bridging the Gap, the reason faculty members come to our summer workshop is because they have academic expertise, deep expertise in particular issue areas, and they don't know how to translate that and communicate that to policy audiences. So even if you have policy audiences that are open to hearing outside voices, you've got to be able to have academics who can deliver. And it's one of the reasons why the think tanks are so successful. They know how to put together a product that's going to be of value to people in government. And this is hard for academics. Academics are trained to explain things. They are trained to analyze. They are trained to say, well, in 70% of the time, civil wars end the following way. Okay, if you're Derek Chollet and you're dealing with the civil war in Syria and you're speaking to that academic, if you're Derek, you're kind of going to want to know, well, okay, so tell me what you think I should do about this particular problem I have right now. And if that academic isn't either able or willing to do that, then their voice is going to be, relatively limited. We started a new project last year in Virginia Gap called New Voices in National Security. And both Kori and Derek were supposed to be with us for our in-person session on May 1st that we've had to postpone. But it was on the future of America's alliances. We did two in 2019. We did one on sanctions and one on digital authoritarianism. And the idea behind the project is bring 6 young academic scholars from outside of DC to meet with people from the policy community around a specific issue area. And we work with them in advance of the meeting. We ask the policy types for what kind of questions would you like to see academics answer for you. We ask those scholars to write short memos. And, it's a great way to try to get some outside voices in, but I think we need more of that. But the academics, they need a lot of work coaching on how to speak to that community, and they need to they need to get beyond their natural hesitation to say something definitive. Nuance is the way to go in academia. And if somebody on the Hill says, well, what do I need for this piece of legislation? You need to be able to give that person something concrete.
So I'm laughing because when I was a 26-year-old NATO desk officer in General Powell's Joint Staff, he used to tell me that there were lots of reasons to fire me, but the only reason not to was because I was the only NATO expert he'd ever met who, when he asked me what time it was, I would just tell him what time it was instead of the history of timekeeping.
It's the quest for the one-handed economist, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking with Kori Schake of the American Enterprise Institute, Jim Goldgeier of the Brookings Institute and American University, and Derek Chollet of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I really wish that we could have held this conversation in person at Beaver Creek, but I've been enriched by it nonetheless, and I really appreciate you guys sharing your time and your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Great to be with you all.
Great to be here. Thanks.
You guys are so great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.